let's start off with our 4 basic categories of unemployment, and then I'll give a brief definition, then we'll look at them in a little bit more detail. Frictional unemployment. This simply has to do with the fact that unemployed people need to take time to find a new job. Okay, so this has to do with the job search. It's not necessarily a problem. Okay, this will happen to all of us at some point in our careers. Structural unemployment, on the other hand, can be a big problem, because what's happening with structural unemployment is that people's skills don't match the available jobs in the economy, and this could become long-term unemployment. Okay, this could become chronic unemployment for people with outmoded skills. Institutional unemployment is technically a subset of structural unemployment, but I think it's important enough to break it out into its own category. And of course, institutions, it means the rules that structure economic interactions between people. And specifically with unemployment, we're going to focus on, well, how would the labor market rules influence the unemployment situation? And this will be kind of the most interesting one, if you ask me, and we've got lots of different examples of screwed up labor market rules that will cause chronic unemployment in various economic situations. Okay, and then finally we have cyclical unemployment, which, as its name implies, is associated with the business cycle. It's associated with recessions, economic downturns, where there's a decline in overall economic activity and therefore an overall decline in the demand for workers in all industries. Let's take a closer look then at frictional unemployment. This is defined as short-term unemployment that's caused by difficulties of matching employee to employer, or as I like to say, this is about the job search. Not usually a big problem. It's only a problem if you can't find information about available jobs, or if companies can't find information about available people. Fortunately, we live in the age of the internet, where you go online, you can find jobs all over the world right now. Okay, companies can go online, find resumes, find applicants from all over the world right now. So frictional unemployment is probably at an all-time low because of our great advances in information technology. So we don't have to say too much more about frictional. Let's move on then and talk about structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is persistent long-term unemployment that's caused by long-lasting shocks or permanent changes in the economy. And specifically, I want to focus on two aspects of this here. Technology shocks are going to be a big one. Okay? New technologies come along, they create new industries, they displace old industries. Naturally, they require workers with new skill sets, and they're going to make certain old skill sets that workers have obsolete. Okay. Globalization is really just a subset of technology. Trade is nothing more than a technology that we use to make our lives better. But specifically globalization, we can open up new markets, we open up trade opportunities with different regions of the world. It happens relatively suddenly, okay, so it's a shock. And this is definitely going to lead to some economic changes. It's definitely going to lead to some employment changes. Okay? What we've seen in the U.S. and manufacturing in particular over the past several decades at least is a decline in manufacturing employment. Okay, this actually isn't a decline in our manufacturing sector. The value of manufactured goods continues to rise, other than in recession periods. But what we definitely have seen is a reduction in employment in manufacturing in the U.S. and rise in service sector employment in the U.S. Okay. Let me give you some historical examples to help you sink your teeth into this. Here's one of my favorite ones. You go back 100 years or so, every town, every village in the U.S. has a blacksmith. What did the blacksmiths do? Okay. The Industrial Revolution has occurred by 100 years ago. Blacksmiths don't make wrought iron anymore. They're not making nails. They're not making nuts and bolts. All that's done in a factory. But there's one thing you still need a blacksmith for, and that is to shoe the horses of the nation's transportation system. Okay? We're still largely on a horse and buggy, a horse and wagon system in 1900. And to shoe horses, every horse's hoof is unique. So what the blacksmith's main task is at this point in time is to fit the horseshoe blanks to the different hooves of every horse, and that's what your village smithy does. Okay, of course that's going to be replaced in a fairly short period of time. You know, by the 1920s, the village blacksmith is pretty much gone because the horse and buggy has been replaced by the automobile. So you potentially have structural unemployment in the blacksmith industry, although blacksmiths were no dummies and they did kind of see this coming, and you see a lot of examples where blacksmiths would start switching over, start working on cars. Okay? So structural unemployment probably wasn't even that big of a deal because it didn't happen it didn't happen overnight. Okay, it actually happens over a period of decades. I think the textbook makes reference to the typewriter repairman. Here's a dying breed. Typewriters go way down in popularity with the rise of the personal computer. If you trained to be a typewriter technician in, say, about 1980, you're probably going to face some employment problems because the personal computer really comes into its own and replaces typewriters for most business purposes. Okay, so there's an example where you have new technology displacing the old technology, the new skill set replacing the old skill set. Okay, and then globalization, of course, we have outsourcing, often a dirty word amongst the American public, but this is actually a source of great economic gains. Okay, we're replacing high-cost labor with low-cost labor. That enables companies to reduce the cost of the goods they sell. Okay, competitive industries reduce the cost. In a perfectly competitive equilibrium, they reduce the cost down to the minimum average total cost. Consumer gets all the surplus. This is actually a great source of economic progress and economic growth. But it, yes, is painful for workers in those domestic industries who find themselves unable to compete in that industry with the cheaper foreign labor. Okay, so the workers in, for example, the U.S. textile industry basically started leaving the U.S. in the 1960s, 1970s. They're going to face a lot of structural unemployment, no doubt. Okay. Structural unemployment, again, can be problematic because it can be long-term. Okay. Long-term unemployment, people can lose their skills. Okay. People can become unemployable. So structural unemployment is going to be a big problem. As we've mentioned, their skills can atrophy, and businesses are going to be wary of hiring people who have been unemployed for a long time. They're thinking, what's wrong with you? Why are you unemployable? So it kind of raises a red flag. Okay, next we have institutional unemployment. Institutional unemployment, a very interesting kind of unemployment. This again is persistent long-term unemployment. It's technically a kind of structural unemployment, but it's caused by labor market rules and regulations that either discourage hiring amongst businesses or encourage people to remain unemployed. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some specific kinds of rules, and we'll look at some examples of this. How could the rules structure a bad unemployment outcome? And one of my favorite, this is one of my mottos here when it comes to institutions and economics: you change the rules, you change the outcomes. And of course, we'll see it's another application of this age-old economics concept that incentives matter. Okay. Let's take a look at unemployment benefits. Okay. This is a type of insurance program. It's meant to ease the financial hardship unemployed people experience when they become laid off, when they lose their work for no fault of their own. But we have to realize that if we make being unemployed too easy, we might see more people choosing to be unemployed, or having less of an incentive to get back into the labor force right away. I like to use the analogy of a chair. Which of these chairs are you going to sit in for a longer period of time? Well, obviously you're going to choose the one that's a lot more comfortable. Okay? If I give you the concrete chair, or God forbid the cactus chair, you're probably not going to remain seated too long, if at all. Okay? So we change the comfort level of a situation, we change the expected results in terms of how long people will remain in that situation. How much does this matter? Well, a neat thing that we can look at is that we did a kind of experiment by changing not the level of unemployment benefits, but the duration of unemployment benefits in the U.S. economy in the 2009 recession. So here's an economist who's posting this in a blog asking how much do 99 weeks of unemployment benefits raise the unemployment rate. And he looks at a whole bunch of different studies done by a whole bunch of different economists. There's this range of estimates. Here we've got somebody saying 0.4 to 1.8 based on a whole bunch of studies, 0.77 to 1.4. Okay. Well, take about the midpoint. It's going to be about a 1 percentage point effect on the unemployment rate. What does this mean? Well, the unemployment rate with these extended benefits is 7.9. This is implying that without extending the benefits, it would have only been 6.9. That's a significant difference. You'll notice the long-run average is 5 to 6%. Well, that's a lot closer to that long-run average. Okay, so do unemployment benefits matter? They clearly do. Lots of economists have taken a look and studied this, and they said, yeah, got a significant and discernible effect on the unemployment rate. Second, minimum wage. This is one we're pretty familiar with. We actually looked at this back in Unit 1. It's an example of a price floor. In this case, it's a price floor on unskilled labor. Let's briefly review what happens here. Here we've got a labor market, demand of labor, supply of labor, a market wage level, a market level of employment. Okay. And as we're familiar, when we set a floor, which is a minimum wage, we get an employment level that's reduced, but a quantity supplied of labor that's increased. And the result, of course, is unemployment. And remember, the result here, this is only going to affect people who aren't worth the minimum wage. Okay, very low skilled people, people without job experience, people without education. And this shows up, not surprisingly, in the teen unemployment rate. The teen unemployment rate, remember, is persistently about 3 times higher than the overall unemployment rate, both in times of economic boom and recession. Okay. Moving on, then, we can look at another institutional aspect that can contribute to unemployment, which is the presence of labor unions. Okay, and this is not to disparage labor unions, okay, but we do want to observe that there is an economic impact on the employment situation when you have unions operating in an economy. The basic goal of unions, of course, is to raise the union workers' compensation. Could be strictly in the form of higher wages, higher benefits, could be in the form of better working conditions, but we'll just combine all of that in a total sum, which is compensation, and we'll model it again with supply and demand. Now, how do unions do this? Of course, they do it through collective bargaining. They can withhold the entire labor supply from an employer, and of course, they do that ultimately through the threat of strike. And by doing this, a union, you must know, it is acting as a monopoly on a resource here, which is the company's labor supply. Okay, so unions act like a monopoly. You remember back from your micro, what do monopolies do? They raise prices and reduce quantities. Okay, when we talk about raising the price of labor and reducing the quantity of labor in a particular industry or a particular business, well, that's going to be unemployment. Okay, reducing the quantity relative to what a competitive market would have allowed for. Let me just note here as well, how do unions prevent competition from non-union workers? Back in the old days, and not actually even recently, they've been known for violence. Okay, they bust some kneecaps. They prevent, because the thing is, how do you prevent workers who are eager to work at the market equilibrium wage? That even though the unions think that's too low, there are lots of people out there who really need the work and are willing to work at the lower wage. So how do the union members prevent that? Well, threats and violence is one traditional way they use. More recently, they've toned down the violence somewhat. They use collective bargaining rights that they had imposed on the employers through legislation like the Wagner Act. And just a brief note here, if you followed the right to work debate at all in the state of Indiana and more recently in the state of Michigan, both recently became right to work states, what this is all about is right to work laws are aimed at curbing union power by limiting their ability to impose collective bargaining. Okay? In right to work states, individual workers can choose to opt out of union membership and union dues paying and make their own bargaining make their own contracts with the employers. And what you'll see when right to work gets enacted in a state is a reduction in the unionization rate. Let's model the effects of labor unions. You know, this will be very similar to the model we use for assessing the effect of minimum wage. Now, there's going to be 2 basic effects we'll look at. First off was when we have only a low percentage of the workforce in an economy being unionized. So here I have industry X. It doesn't matter what industry it is. It could be the steel industry, let's say, and that's unionized. And what happens here, of course, is that the unions are going to want to push up the wage above the equilibrium level. This is exactly like the minimum wage effect. And you notice now the quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, and we have unemployment. Okay. In an economy where a very small percentage of industries or businesses are unionized, what will happen? Well, do the unemployed workers in this industry, do they just sit around saying, I can only work in this industry, I can work in no other? No, of course not. What they will do, these workers who are unemployed in industry X because they can't compete on wage grounds, they're going to leave. They're going to go to industry Y and Z and all other industries in the economy, which are non-union. What happens here when we add workers to industry Y is we're going to be increasing the supply of labor in industry Y, And by increasing supply, we're going to reduce the market wage and increase the quantity of labor and industry-wide. This is basically all other industries in the economy. So the result we see when you have a low rate of unionization is a high union wage premium, but no permanent unemployment effect. This pretty much describes the U.S. economy. What we see in the U.S. is a small number of unionized industries, and here's the union wage level. Most industries non-unionized, and what you see is a 15% on average premium for union workers versus non-union workers. And note here, I'm talking about union workers in a particular industry. Okay, let's say this is the unionized steel companies, and this would be the non-unionized steel companies. So we're not just talking about union workers in general earn more than non-unionized workers. That's also true, but I'm talking about unionized steel workers earn more than non-unionized steel workers. And why? Well, again, the economics is very clear, because they can reduce the quantity and increase the price, as a monopolist does, and that means they increase the quantity and reduce the price amongst the non-union competing companies. Okay. Well, there's no unemployment effect here. I mean, this is interesting, but there's no unemployment effect. This basically describes the U.S. economy, by the way, with a very low rate of unionization. Where does the unemployment effect come from? Well, let's take a look at an economy that has a high rate of unionization. In other words, all or most of the industries in this economy are unionized. Okay. So here I have an economy where all the industries are unionized, and what happens? Well, the unions are going to raise the wage above market equilibrium in every industry, and they're going to cause a situation where the quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded in every industry, cause a surplus of labor in every industry, and what we see here is a significantly higher economy-wide unemployment rate. Okay, so when you have a high unionization rate, you're going to have unemployment effects. When you have a low unionization rate, you're mainly going to have the union wage premium effect. Okay, one final thing we'll look at, and this is very interesting, very subtle differences, but very striking differences between different economies, is the way the labor market law is structured. The best way to think about this would be to simply contrast the U.S. versus European economies. Okay, the U.S., what we have is known as employment at will labor doctrine. What this means is both the employee and the employer can terminate a work contract at any time for any reason. Of course, it's obvious on the employee, from the employee's perspective, if an employee can't terminate, meaning an employee can't leave a job at any time for any reason, that would be known as slavery. Okay, that's been illegal in the U.S., fortunately, for a long time. Okay, but what about the employer? We do have some anti-discrimination laws, and that's designed to prevent some arbitrary discrimination against certain groups of people based on race, based on religion, and so on and so forth. But in general terms, the employer can still fire you if you're not being productive. If you're a lazy worker, if you're not an effective worker, you're gone, right? And that's the main economic reason we want to remember here. Employers are going to fire people because they're not productive. Okay, they're not contributing more than they are paid, and they therefore are a drag on the company. In an employment at will system, it's easy for companies, for employers to get rid of non-productive workers. Relatively easy. There are no barriers to firing or laying off workers for, quote, economic reasons. Right? We see this in mass layoffs. We see it's easy to hire workers in an at-will system because it's easy to fire workers in an at-will system. All right. Let's contrast to European economies. So they have what I like to call job security laws. They do not have the at-will doctrine for employers. Of course, they do have it for employees, otherwise it would be slavery, but they do not have it for companies, for employers. Employers face strict legal limitations on firing workers. It's complex, but just briefly, if a European company wants to fire workers, they have to go through court processes. They have to prove to a judge that the worker is unproductive, that the worker is lazy, that the worker is a derelict, and so on and so forth. Okay. The workers have the benefit of the doubt. The workers have very strong legal protections against losing their jobs. The result is that it's really costly to let go of workers. You have to put up with legal fees. Okay? You have to hire attorneys. You have to go to court. Okay? You have to take time out of managing your company to go through all these legal hoops. So what does this mean? Well, if it's very costly to fire people, companies are going to be very cautious about hiring people. Okay? The job security law, great for the workers who have jobs, but ironically, it's going to make it very hard for people who don't have jobs to get jobs because they become potentially a huge liability for these companies. And the textbook has a great analogy here. I really encourage you to read this. It's chapter 11 in the book. They say, think about it this way. In the dating scene, if every date required marriage, you think it'd be easier or harder to find a date? Okay? In other words, every date is a permanent commitment. You're going to be very cautious about agreeing to go out with somebody, right? Well, that's what's going on in European labor markets. The job contract requires a long-term commitment. Companies are going to be very cautious about engaging new workers. We've got these 4 different factors that we've identified here behind institutional unemployment. Let's look at some data. Let's look at some real-world comparisons. When we see that, again, comparing the U.S. against Europe, European economies face these institutional problems much more so than the U.S. Take a look at unemployment benefits in Europe. There's 2 dimensions of unemployment benefits. First off is your replacement rate, and that's what the replacement rate of your previous wages, that's what this chart is covering. France, 80%, Germany, 74%, Spain, 70%. In European economies, it's a 2/3 plus replacement rate. Okay. In the U.S., it's just over 1/3. Okay, so basically the replacement of your previous wages is about double, and notice this is for the first year. Now the second dimension of the benefits is how long do they last. In the U.S. traditionally they don't last more than half a year. Now there's some special situations and special circumstances, so you'll see that a few people get them, and so the average is brought way down for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th year. But in Europe they don't go down that much. In some cases they barely go down at all. Look, in Germany they only went down by 2 percentage points. Okay. In France, they go from 80 to 60. What's the deal here for the unemployed worker? 4 years of unemployment, I'm still getting almost 3/4 of my previous pay for doing 0% of the previous work. Okay? Not surprisingly, you're going to see more people choose to be unemployed. I can only imagine, they asked the little kids in Germany, Hannah and Dietrich, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the kids say, well, I want to be unemployed. What else? Okay, so not only does Europe have higher unemployment benefits on both dimensions, they have higher minimum wages. Take a look at this chart here. Okay, U.S. actually is not doing too great here, but a lot of European countries, France, Britain, Greece, boy, there's a chronic unemployment situation if we've ever seen one. Okay, some of these other northern and western European countries, they have very high minimum wage rates. Look at this in Luxembourg, it's up to $15+ an hour. You're thinking, oh, that's great. Yeah, great for you if you're worth that. Actually, irrelevant for you if you're worth that. If you're a young kid just out of school with no skills and experience, this condemns you to unemployment. You really see this in Greece. Okay, and notice Greece's minimum wage isn't much higher than the U.S. in raw terms, but in relative terms, I imagine it's actually quite a bit higher because it's not quite as developed an economy. Once again, Europe, when it comes to unionization, has much higher unionization rates. What we're looking at here is the proportion of all workers covered by collective bargaining. And look, the U.S. is way down here. The unions are on the wane in the U.S., way down here, around maybe 12-15%. Look at some of these. Again, here's France, chronic offender here. Belgium, a lot of these Western and Northern European countries, some of the Southern European countries, have very high, we're talking 3/4 plus, almost up to 100%. France here, almost up to 100% of their people in unions. That's going to keep their wages persistently higher, put upward pressure on the wages, and put downward pressure on quantity, and of course, result in a chronic unemployment situation. Finally, Europe has limited or no employment at will for employers, whereas the U.S. generally we have a pretty strong employment at will doctrine. This article here chronicles how difficult it is to let go of somebody in France because of these protections, because of this job security. So what do we expect to see? You have institutional factors that would contribute to chronically higher unemployment rates. And surprise, surprise, look at the unemployment rate in the European Union. This goes way back to the 90s. Okay, so this covers both periods of recession and boom. And take a look. The European unemployment rate for the overall European economy is averaging something like 9–10%. It goes down in good times, it goes up in recession, but the overall level is much higher. Contrast that to the US. Okay? Again, our overall average is something around 5–6%. Ours goes way down in good times. Look at this. It goes down to 3.8 at the height of the 90s boom. It goes down to 4.4 in the housing boom. It goes way up to 10%. The U.S. unemployment rate does fluctuate a lot more, but the overall average level is much lower. Why? Well, it's because our labor market institutions are much more flexible and much more conducive to new hiring than these stodgy European labor institutions. Okay? With their higher minimum wages, their higher unemployment benefits, their higher unionization rates, and their lack of the at-will doctrine. It's a pretty clear-cut example of those institutional effects at work. Okay, finally, this brings us to cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is unemployment correlated with the business cycle. You have a decrease in economic growth. You have a recession where economic growth goes negative. You're going to have a big jump in unemployment. Obviously, we have a lot of layoffs happening in a downturn. And we have, furthermore, that you have a lot of idle workers and idle buildings and idle machines. We're not maximizing our potential growth, and therefore we're not encouraging the creation of new jobs. Okay. Cyclical unemployment, let me take you back one more time to the long-term unemployment trend in the U.S., and you can see it just shoots up. When unemployment shoots up here, almost straight up, in times of recession, the gray bars are recession periods. Okay. In the 1973-74 recession, bam. In the 1980-82, a double dip, it shoots up, phase one, and then bam, phase two, it shoots way up. Okay, the 2008-2009 recession, bam, unemployment rate shoots up. This component here, this is cyclical unemployment. Okay, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on when it comes to policies, economic policies, to help ameliorate the unemployment situation. We're not generally going to worry too much about frictional unemployment. We're not generally going to worry too much about structural unemployment. We might worry about how can we help structurally unemployed workers, but frictional and structural unemployment are actually what we call natural to the economy. Okay? Frictional unemployment is involved with a job search that has to occur for people to find jobs, and structural unemployment is usually associated with technological advances and global competition, which are the ingredients of economic growth and prosperity. Okay, so these aren't necessarily what we want to get rid of. So the natural unemployment concept, we're talking about adding structural and frictional unemployment. That changes slowly over time, even though it can bounce around with these economic shocks that occur. But we want to distinguish that from the cyclical unemployment, which is that big increase in unemployment associated with the business cycle.